What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and we are on the cusp of the biggest Warhammer 40,000 tournament in the world, the Las Vegas Open, which, to my knowledge, has just hit 1,000 registered players. So I've spent all morning peering through dozens and dozens of lists from this huge event and picking out some of the wildest and zaniest ones that we can watch over the weekend. As always, if you like my Warhammer 40k content, remember to hit like on the video, subscribe on the channel, all the YouTube stuff, you know what's up. You've been here before. And let's dive into it. Now, as a bit of a note before we dive into these lists, LVO 2023 is using the Nephilim version of the rules. So while we have seen a couple data slates as well as a new GT packet change a lot of things, especially how lists are constructed and a lot of balance updates for the game, this event is not using any of those. We'll start with a pretty classic style of list. Let's talk about Mike Russell's Death Skulls Orcs. Now, these guys operate a little bit differently from the normal Orc lists that you'll see like Goths, whereas Goths are focused more on doing damage with extra strength and exploding attacks. Death Skulls are all about taking your objectives away.
This is like taking candy from a baby.
And I've talked previously about how I think that while Goths are going to be doing a little bit more damage in the Ark's Bowman season with the lack of Armor of Contempt, so low AP weapons like Champas do that much more damage, Death Skulls definitely have a strong part to play also in Warzone Nephilim, since it matters significantly less that you kill the target that you're charging as long as you end the turn on their objectives, because every infantry model in your army gets objective secured. This list in particular is running a Death Skulls battalion plus a patrol, bringing a war boss in mega armor, a weird boy, as well as tons and tons of those OBSEC infantry. We don't have so many troops in the list, only bringing 3 units of Gretchen for get the good bits, as well as a couple of truck boys for the ability to jump out of a transport and then immediately charge, but we are focusing very heavily on specialist infantry like commandos, storm boys, and mega knobs. Since these guys retain all of their special abilities and also get that objective secured, it's almost like you're playing with lots of troops, except your troops just have better weapons and deal more damage. All told, this classic Horde-style Orc list is bringing 30 Commandos, 30 Storm Boys, 16 Mega Knobs, and 10 Tank Bustas alongside those Truck Boys and 30 Gretchen. This is a classic style of Orc list, and I'm excited to see it on the table. Moving on, we'll talk about a list after my own heart that's a little bit more technically interesting given the really interesting mechanics that it makes use of. This is Stephen Box's list, who you'll probably recognize from the Vanguard Tactics YouTube channel, who you should absolutely go check out for incredible tactical and competitive 40k content. To this year's LVO, Stephen is bringing Azure Yanni and taking a pretty wild, far-flung craft world build. This one in particular is making use of the Children of Khaine and Vengeful subfaction abilities. These give it +1 damage on wound rolls of 6 and exploding 6s in melee. Now, the combination of both a 6 to wound ability and an exploding 6 to hit ability is not new in Warhammer 40k, and the two often synergize pretty well because those exploding 6s to hit give you additional wound rolls that you could potentially be exploding into that extra damage, alongside psychic powers like Doom for wound rerolls, and you're getting that additional damage distressingly often. Eldar units typically have a lot of attacks, so these multiplicative kind of abilities also tend to work well on units like Aspect Warriors. And this list focuses extremely heavily on Aspect Warriors, with 2 units of Howling Banshees, one with the Piercing Strikes and Mirror Swords combo for 2 or maybe even 3 damage melee attacks on that Exarch, the other one with the Crone Scream and Nerve Shredding Shriek combo to deal a ton of mortal wounds on the charge, alongside 15 Striking Scorpions, a smaller unit of 5 with Crushing Blows for automatic wounds on the Exarch's attacks, and a big unit of 10 with Deadly Ambush, giving it +1 to hit and +1 AP if the unit is entirely within terrain. Given that LVO is using player-placed terrain, that lets Steven potentially set up ambushes for his opponent in the most optimal places on the table, where they're going to be forced to walk into the deadly counterattack of these Striking Scorpions. But that's not all. There's also 2 units of Shining Spears, one with Expert Lancers for +1 to hit on the charge, the other one with the Heartstrike and Paragon Saber combo to get full rerolls to hit and wound and potentially convert those rerolls into mortal wounds thanks to Heartstrike. For some fire support, there's also some classic options like Warwalkers and support weapon D-cannon platforms, and a little bit of objective secured granted by Rangers and a Farseer Skyrunner with the Sunstorm relic. We also have, just as a classy include, the avatar of Khaine itself, which doesn't see enough competitive play, mostly for the fact that it's a big, kind of slow melee monster, but in this case, it is going to be buffing up all of those aspect warriors, and I think that plays to this list's strengths in a big way. Eldar has a lot of interesting sub-faction options, and this is one of the most interesting builds that I've seen coming out of the faction, so I'm excited to watch Stephen Box's progress throughout the event.
We will watch your career with great interest.
So moving on, we'll talk about a little bit of a blast from the past list. A list I've actually already covered on this channel, but it's making a reappearance at LVO, and hopefully it can perform as well as it did the last time I made a video about it. These are Ryan Averil's Ultramarines. Now, if you want to hear me go over this style of list in greater detail, I do talk about it in my previous video. The most important combinations in the list is the combination of an Astraeus super heavy tank alongside Roboot Guilliman as the army's warlord. Roboot has a reroll 1's aura for any Imperium unit, meaning that he can affect the Astraeus with his rerolls, and with the combination of a Primaris Master of the Forge to give it +1 to hit. That means it's hitting on 2s and rerolling 1s. There's actually a little bit of synergy here, given the fact that it is an Ultramarines super heavy detachment containing that Astraeus, because the Ultramarines chapter tactic, when applied to Titanic ranged units, is actually a debuff, given that it gives them -1 to hit with their ranged weapons when they fall back. However, Titanic units can fall back and shoot without penalty just innately. The Astraeus Super Heavy has incredible damage output and a lot of resilience for its points, especially when supported by that Master of the Forge, who can repair it if it doesn't get one-rounded, which it probably won't be. We also have a ton of damage coming in with the rest of the list, including 2 units of 5 Eradicators with heavy melta rifles and multi-meltas. These guys are obviously going to benefit enormously from the Ultramarine Super Doctrine. Once they're in Tactical Doctrine, they count as remaining stationary, meaning that they can shoot their guns without penalty even after moving. We have a Primaris Chief Apothecary to keep those guys alive, a couple Inceptors to add a little bit of flexibility to the list, and Infiltrators just to hold down objectives. For the most part, this is the Guilliman and Astraeus gun show. If you don't deal with the Astraeus, it does fly and has enough movement to jump around a lot of pieces of terrain and really rinse your army to death. If you overextend to kill it, those Eradicators with a bunch of rerolls from Guilliman are gonna absolutely ruin your day. Now, speaking of enormous amounts of heavy armor, let's talk about some Tau Empire and Drew Salzborn's Tau Seps list. Now, Drew's actually a local of mine. He plays lists like this in the local community, and he keeps shooting everyone to death with railguns. In fact, he calls this list the Astra MiliTAUrum because it's as close to an Astra MiliTAUrum list as you can get in a Xenos faction, with the part of infantry squads being played by Kroot and Kroot Hounds, which don't get double moves or any special orders, but they do get that pregame move, allowing the list to put a lot of primary objective pressure on its opponent from the beginning of the game, and then follow that up with just a ridiculous amount of shooting. The list is bringing Long Strike, 3 Hammerhead gunships, and 3 Sky Rays, which cover each other's weaknesses in terms of damage output pretty well, as well as 2 Sunshark Bombers to occupy your opponent on the first turn. We have Exemplar of the Kalyan on the Ethereal of the list, meaning those Sunshark Bombers could drop into Strategic Reserve on the first turn if there is a chance they would get killed, but oftentimes this list will just deploy almost everything on the line, force its opponent to run out of hiding to actually deal with the massive amount of T7 wounds bearing down on it, and if you can't kill it quickly enough, it will very rapidly shoot your entire army to death. Even if you try to play passively and hide behind your terrain, the Kroot will eventually charge onto your home objectives, get buffed up with the Brothrod gland, do actually a surprising amount of damage, and steal all of your objectives away because they are objective secured, at least on those Kroot carnivore units. In addition to being an absolute meme, this list is very effective, and I've streamed some of Drew's games from the Winter Assault GT at Everwinter this past December elsewhere on the channel, so you can actually go see this player with a very similar list in action. Now, speaking of spamming armored units to the utmost degree, let's talk about a player who I think comes up every single LVO for the absolute chicanery that he brings to the event, Clifton Russell's Black Legion. Fuck yeah! This is the wildest Chaos Space Marine list I think I've ever seen, and I'm sure there's a lot of technology designed within it that I am not aware of, because it's very weird. This one is bringing a single Black Legion battalion detachment that looks pretty standard. We've got some Possessed with the Black Rune of Damnation, a Master of Executions with Hatred Incarnate and Uloka the Black. This gives it mortal wounds in addition to normal damage thanks to the Demon Weapon, Hatred Incarnate, giving the Master of Executions full hit rerolls, and situational wound rerolls because Master of Executions get wound rerolls against enemy characters. That makes this guy an extremely good assassin. There's 3 units of Chosen with Power Fists, as well as a couple Cultist units and Legionnaires to make up the troop Troops allotment, a Master Possession, and a Warpsmith in the HQ slot. That Warpsmith is going to be useful for supporting the 6 Terrax pattern termite drills that this list also sports. Each of them equipped with 2 Terrax Heavy Flamers. Now, for those who don't know, the Terrax Termite Drill has an absolutely wild profile. They are 14 wound T8 monstrosities with the ability to deep strike and deep strike an embarked unit with them. The most important thing for this particular list, in my opinion, is that they sport a 5-shot Melta gun in their Terrax Melta Cutter, and because they are Black Legion, if they are targeting the closest eligible enemy with those Melta shots, they get +1 to hit, bringing them down to hitting on 2s. Alongside 2 heavy flamer shots and a ridiculous melee profile, these guys are going to be bringing the pain once they dump all of their lethal payload out on the middle of the table. While we do have a little bit of synergy in stratagems like Tip of the Spear to grant reroll charges to units when they're coming out of those termite drills, I think the termite drills themselves are absolutely the star of the show. Having some possessed and Chaos Space Marines bowling down the table at you is difficult to deal with when your opponent puts 84 toughness, 8 wounds, each equipped with 5 Melta guns directly in front of your army.
That's a lot of damage!
Things are getting a little crazy in here, so we're going to calm ourselves down a little bit. Talk about a little bit more of a standard list, at least a list I think we're going to be seeing a lot of in Arcs of Omen, because these are Cody Brandt's Space Wolves. This list is pretty stock standard, but still an absolute delight. Almost entirely eschewing troops options, bringing only a single patrol detachment, running 10 infiltrators in the troop slot for whatever reason. I guess sometimes you just don't want a combat squad, you know? You just want a big brick of 10 dudes to wander around the table. But that's followed up with a Space Wolves Vanguard detachment running as many elite options as we can pack in there. This includes 2 10-model Wolfguard squads with a combination of Storm Shields, Thunderhammers, and Lightning Claws, a 10-model Wolfen unit, bringing a combination of their Thunderhammer, Storm Shield, and Frostclaw weapons, as well as the maximum allotment of Thunderwolf cavalry units allowed for this army. That's 3 units of 3 Thunderwolves with Storm Shields and Thunderhammers spread between the Vanguard and patrol detachments. And following that up with a Librarian caddying Instincts Awoken to allow any of these units to switch back into Assault Doctrine. This means that even if you engage before the 3rd turn of the game, you're going to be getting the effect of that +1 AP in melee and exploding 6s thanks to the Space Wolf Super Doctrine, because we are using a successor chapter running Hungry for Battle for +1 to charge and Whirlwind of Rage for an additional set of exploding 6s. Each of these units is effectively carrying Tesla weapons in melee. With the Lord on Thunderwolf upgraded to a Chapter Master and giving full hit rerolls to whatever one of these units is engaging first, they deal absolutely incredible damage once that Assault Doctrine is active. Relatively standard stuff, but it's still cool to see the charge of the Thunderwolf cavalry in action. And you know what else is cool to see in action? Bio-Titans. Let's talk about Dustin Hines' Tyranids list. This one bringing a list out of High Fleet Chronos for a bonus on ranged weapons. Unfortunately, that doesn't apply to the star of the list, being a Hierophant Bio-Titan, because it's being brought in a super heavy auxiliary detachment, but that doesn't mean that the Hierophant is not here to clown around. The rest of the list is bringing some support for the Titan itself, including a brace of Tyranid warriors to add some board presence, a Neurothrope with Catalyst and Onslaught, alongside Zoanthropes and Tyranid Primes to donate their Synaptic Imperatives to it. We have a Death Leaper and an Exocrine to add some more onboard presence. That Death Leaper bringing Alien Cunning to add a little bit of additional objective secured. Pretty useful if it can just hide behind the enormous legs of a Hierophant. Now, for those who haven't seen a Hierophant Bio-Titan in action, these things are an absolute chad. Coming in at a massive 34 wounds at toughness 8 with a built-in invulnerable save that can be improved if it's being affected by the Zoanthrope Synaptic Imperative, and can get a 6+ damage ignore from Catalyst on top of that. They fire an enormous 16 Strength 10 AP3 3 damage gunshots that they can improve to get +1 to wound if they take a couple mortal wounds every time they go to shoot. They're also no slouch close up, bringing a 2d6 Strength 7 AP3 Flamer weapon, 6 Strength 10 AP3 flat, 6 damage attacks with a built-in reroll, as well as Lash Whips for 10 additional Strength 5 AP1 mini attacks. They also have the ability to transport infantry, able to carry up to 2 of those Tyranid warrior squads hanging off the sides. The biggest downside of the Hierophant Bio-Titan, and the reason this list is probably a little bit more of a meme than it is highly competitive, is the fact that it's a lot of times physically too large to be placed in your deployment zone, which creates all sorts of problems. You can reposition it pretty effectively because It does have the fly keyword, I think meant to represent the fact that it's kind of stalking above the battlefield on its enormous spider legs, but that lets it use the encircle the prey stratagem. Despite the fact that this thing is about 4 stories tall and weighs hundreds of tons, in the furor of battle, fighting against a bunch of Tyranid warriors who are probably hiding behind a building and not even in your line of sight anyway, it's easy to lose this thing. That lets it stalk around the sides of the table, deep strike later on in the game, and hit you with those huge biocannon shots from an unexpected angle. The other problem with the Hierophant Bio-Titan is its bizarre base rules. It doesn't actually have a base, but thanks to a designer's note printed on the datasheet, it's sort of implied to play as if it had a base. And because the model itself is about 11 inches in every diameter, that makes it functionally impossible to play around a lot of terrain, since terrain and units can't technically go between its enormous legs. If you FAQ the model to hull measure like it probably should do, it plays a lot more naturally. But the fact that LVO is using player plays terrain does actually make it so you can create some good avenues that this Hierophant can use to move up the table. Overall, it's a pretty sweet list. I wish Dustin the best. And sadly, that moves us on to the last list that we're going to be talking about today, and a list that feels like comes up every single LVO. This time being run by William Pagonis. This is William's Cadian Astra MiliTAUrum. We've talked about super heavies, we've talked about orc hordes, but you have not lived until you've seen the Cadian White Shield Horde. This brigade detachment is running no less than 240 infantry. That's all.
It's raining men. Hallelujah.
Being supported by a ton of characters, not only in the elite slot with Astrapants, but also company commanders, Lord Castellan Creed himself, as well as Primaris Psychers. This enormous push of bodies is more than most armies can handle. And with the ability to double move, thanks to that White Shield's upgrade, removing the rule that forces conscripts to occasionally ignore orders they receive, these guys are going to be reliably running up the table with double moves. This is using the 8th edition Astra MiliTAUrum Codex, not the 9th edition one, which makes this army possible. Things are going to look a lot different once it comes to Arcs of Omen for Astra MiliTAUrum, but at least in LVO we get the last hurrah of the classic Astra MiliTAUrum meat grinder. We also have some additional fire support, including 9 mortar teams and 3 scout sentinels with las guns. And while it doesn't feel like this list has a lot of damage in it, the introduction of Hammer of the Emperor, now renamed into Born Soldiers, giving the entire army automatic wounds on hit rolls of 6, means that this mass amount of shooting, between 60 and 90 shots per conscript squad, will eventually force failed saves on even the most heavily armored of enemies. Plus, with the ability to make them extremely difficult to kill using Cadian stratagems, these guys can run right up the table, swarm your opponent's objectives, and while you may lose hundreds of infantry, that doesn't give them the chance to come back before the next wave charges up into their lines and steals all of their objectives away with enormous numbers of OBSEC infantry. And while some armies may have the attack volume to remove them, many will not, and that does mean that they typically do relatively well. And with that, those are my picks for the wildest lists from LVO 2023. Let me know down in the comment section which one of these you'd play or you'd like to see live. And if you have any other picks for your craziest armies from LVO. Big thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Big thanks as well for everyone who supports the channel, either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, Twitch subscribers. All you people are great. I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.